If you can recognize in a computer with a dozen or so hardware components, then why don't you recognize in a cell that's got hundreds or thousands of hardware components? It's vastly more complicated.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Creation.Live. In each episode of this show, ICR scientists gather with subject matter experts, apologists, and other special guests to discuss pressing issues, whether that be ICR's current research, something new that's come to light in the scientific community, or something else entirely that ultimately impacts how science points to our Creator, the Lord Jesus Christ. We hope that these conversations are encouraging and enlightening in an increasingly chaotic world. I'm your host, Trey, and I have with me today my co-host, Lauren.
Hello.
And then I have with me as guests, we have Dr. Royal Truman.
Hello.
And of course, the president of ICR, Dr. Randy Galuza.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here. It's awesome to be here on this set with y'all just to talk about some awesome things. So I want to talk about cells. It's something that we've talked about before in various podcasts. I mean, it's a pretty common topic when it comes to just how complex life is. But today we want to talk about maybe a different aspect of cells that we don't get to talk about all the time. And so just as a little bit of background, we know that at one point it wasn't even known that cells existed. They were discovered when the first rudimentary microscopes were invented, and then they're like, oh, there's these little things moving around. Little blobs.
Yeah, like Jello.
Yeah.
And then people thought that they were like simple, that they were nothing more than Jello, right?
Yeah.
But we know now that that is not the case. And you actually have an interesting background that allows you to kind of view these cells as something far more complex. You had mentioned to me that you have a lot of history when it comes to technology and software and hardware and just how complex that is. Can you maybe give just like a brief snippet of like how that came to be?
Right. Turns out that I'd studied chemistry and computer science. And when I joined the world's largest chemical company, I don't want to give any names, I was asked to transfer to Germany because they had just created a think tank. And the idea was they needed a scientist who could understand all the new technologies coming out, software and hardware. And my job was to identify what could be relevant for us and invest into those companies. Maybe these are startups. In some way come into a business deal. And since then, became sort of ingrained in me to look at hardware and software through new eyes. What is new? What's going on in artificial intelligence? What are the different programming styles? What are the different hardware technologies coming out? And all of that was formerly my job. And so when I became passionate about molecular and cell biology, there's this kind of a aha effect. It's like, this looks incredibly familiar.
I've seen this before.
Why is this so easy to understand? And I was reading all these textbooks literally just in one sitting and explaining this to the other molecular biologists. And the reason was it all fit. It all made sense because of this background.
Wow.
So what you had seen in these engineering type aspects, you had seen also in what you saw inside the cells. Is that kind of what you're saying?
That's right. It's like, here's a box and, here's an apple and it always fell into the box. And it was easy not to lose the apple.
That's awesome. And that also kind of makes sense with your story because you also have an engineering background. And so that's part of what ICR is doing with the engineered biology. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. As you point out, I was an engineer, practicing engineer for a decade before I went to medical school and learned all of this about biology. And the engineering background was excellent for medical school because when you get into med school and you start your first 2 years in physiology, it's all engineering. And if you understand systems and how systems work, you're going to be able to understand biology a lot better. And in terms of being a practicing physician, if you understand how something works from start to finish, when it breaks, rather than just memorizing a spreadsheet of signs and symptoms, you actually understand the functioning of it. And you can pinpoint where the pathological problem is a lot better, in my opinion. if you approach biology from an engineering perspective.
It's interesting to me, both of y'all's backgrounds in you're viewing something that is man-made, and then you're taking it and then you're applying it to something that is biological. Why does that work? How come we can look at the biological world and be like, oh, that reminds me of computers. That reminds me of computer systems. Or we can look at the body and we can say, oh, that reminds me of something that I learned in engineering. Why do those rules or laws, I don't know if they're laws, but why do those rules seem to apply so well to the biological world? Dr. Truman, we'll start with you.
What Dr. G said about systems, I think, is a key. Whether you are designing a system as a person or it comes from biology, there are certain principles that have to apply. These things have to be robust, have to be reliable. A cell has to replicate literally millions of times reliably. When you start working backwards, there are certain underlying commonality. There has to be a logic processing, there has to be error repair, there has to be robustness, there has to be redundancy. There's a commonality. That means that if you're, let's say, an alien scientist who thought very differently than our chemists on Earth, these people would still recognize that there are some fundamentals that have to be met.
Even if they had like no knowledge of anything.
For example, if you have movable components, they have to mesh together. They have to function together. There has to be a reliable energy source, not just any old energy like heat, but organized energy. There's a commonality of principles. And we see this also in software engineering, we call it, because we recognize the same principles that we see in normal engineering. You have to build software that doesn't run off in crazy ways because people are making wrong decisions that weren't expected, different parameters, and the logic is running off and doing crazy, crazy, crazy things. We call that software engineering because they're common principles.
Okay.
So I'm curious for Dr. G, your thoughts. Obviously, there are a lot of different views on this planet as far as how these things came about, but we really can condense them into two main worldviews. Either God or an intelligent being created everything, or nature, unintelligent nature, created everything. Could these processes that Dr. Truman and yourself have been talking about, which of these worldviews explains those processes that we see in, for instance, biology best?
Oh, this is a slam dunk.
Question.
Yeah, it's almost a softball question.
Think about it.
I know it's your favorite topic, so curious to hear your thoughts.
When you're talking about engineered systems or systems that, as Dr. Truman just mentioned, function by the same engineering principles as man-made systems, then the best explanation for that, which is consistent with all of human experience, is that they came about from an intelligent source.
Absolutely.
We haven't seen nature put anything together. When we look at living systems and man-made systems, we see multiple parts that are working together for a purpose. That's a type of specified complexity there. And the only source we know of that can put multiple parts working together for a purpose is an intelligent mind. We've never seen natural processes unless you cheat and go to biological systems, which do it. But that's what we're trying to explain. So you can't cheat and appeal to a biological system to explain a biological system. As Lauren mentioned, it's the origin of these things. And so you need a mind with foresight to conceive of what they're going to do, what problems they're going to face. As Dr. Truman mentioned, you need energy. You need control. You need regulation. You need to be able to start something, stop it, and keep it in precise parameters. It needs to be robust. It needs to be resilient. It has to have all of these engineering features or engineered features about it in order for it to function right. And then in going back even to Trey's question, which ties in exactly with what you're saying, is he asked why. Why is it like this? That's almost a theological question because the Bible says that living things were a general revelation from God to humanity, meaning that anybody who has ever lived on any planet can see the fingerprints, the hand, the workmanship of our Creator just by looking at living things. Now, it is possible, since God has absolute freedom and He can do whatever He wants, He could have made living things to operate in a way that humans couldn't even figure out. In other words, we built something and it operates this way, but when it came to living things, it could have operated in a way that was just
Completely mysterious.
completely mysterious,
Yeah.
right? Totally foreign to us, and there was nothing to tie it to in terms of man-made things altogether. But then, how does that reveal anything to us? Trey could say, that evolved, and Lauren, you could say it came from outer space, and Dr. Truman can say it was designed. Which one of you is right? It's hard to say, but he didn't. He chose to make it operate by the same engineering principles as man-made things, and so that when you see a living thing doing function X, and you see a man-made thing doing the exact same function, you can expect to find the same systems, the same system elements in it. And if you know this was made by an intelligent mind, and this is operating by the exact same principles, how can you then say space aliens, evolution? You're almost forced directly into concluding rationally that an intelligent mind put this together just like this.
Absolutely. So,
Something designed this.
yes, yes. So with all of that in mind, all of that important background, let's focus specifically in on cells. What are some of those processes that we see in cells? I'll leave that deliberately open-ended. I want to hear from both of y'all on this.
You'll hear a statement from all molecular biologists, and they'll say everything in a cell is regulated. Every process, every chemical reaction, every organization of the subparts, has something that initiates it, and probably more importantly, something that stops it. There cannot be any runaway processes. You can't have a metabolic enzymatic process that floods the cell with too much of a particular metabolite or product, So everything is regulated. Even recycling. When you don't need a part of the cell, the components get broken down with special enzymes that break down those components into useful components that then get reused again. So this requires energy, but it is only the minimum amount of energy directed and guided. So everything is choreographed. So you have many, many features. One is many components that are working together. There's an enormous interdependency. So you can't say, even when you have a new daughter cell, you can't say, well, first we are creating some more DNA, and then we're creating the molecular machines like ribosomes, and then we are, because you realize quickly that for that to have happened, this must have been there. But that couldn't have happened because it required that to have been there first.
They
But
all have to be in place at the same
It all has
time.
to be at the same time.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Yeah.
So these are the kinds of things that are very, very, very unique about cells. Even more unique, I would say, than engineering systems like machines. Machines, you could say, well, we can assemble certain subcomponents first and then put the other parts together afterwards. You don't have this extreme interdependency.
Yeah, it's staggering. As you mentioned, people thought it was protoplasm, something simple way at the beginning. And molecular biology, even as Dr. Truman has mentioned, has opened up an incredible world of complexity when you just look inside a single cell. It's like a city inside a cell. In many ways, it has a power plant to
And
generate
there's trillions
power.
of them.
There's trillions of them
Yeah,
just
like-
in your body.
Yeah, wow.
And there's over 200 different types of cells in your body, which all start out basically as the same type of cell. And there's mechanisms which send them off on a different path of development. Right when you're just a few cells in terms of development. They start to label themselves in terms of orientation, front, back, top, bottom. It's like laying out a survey system for a building so that you have control over what you're building, where you're building it. You have, as Dr. Truman mentioned, you have little machines that can come in. They can unwind stuff. They can cut pieces of DNA out. They can splice pieces in. Wow. Cells are held together with little joints that are like welded joints or riveted joints. You have transportation mechanisms within them where they lay down little molecules that act like almost like little railroad tracks, and machines will transport something from one part of the cell to the other, but it knows where to go because it's been labeled, and so it goes exactly to where it needs to head. There are command centers and control centers which regulate everything largely, but then individual control centers on parts. As Dr. Truman mentioned, there's a recycling system so that everything goes from fabrication, function, recycling, reuse. It's absolutely phenomenal.
That's incredible.
What's going on there.
It does sound like a city and far more efficient and well-maintained than any city here on Earth that I know of. Certainly more than, well, okay. I was going to say Dallas. I'll say Dallas. Certainly a little more efficient than Dallas.
I'd like to add something to that because Dr. G made a comment that may not be obvious to the average listener. We talk about different parts being sent to different parts of the cell. One has to understand that a cell is not just like a balloon full of liquid. Mm-hmm. It has compartments, substructures with membranes and stuff. These are called organelles. Mm-hmm. So like the nucleus is different than the mitochondria. These can have different pHs. Different things happen in different parts of the cell. For example, we all know there's DNA in the nucleus. There's also DNA distributed in thousands or millions of mitochondria, little bits of DNA. And processing occurs decentralized in those places. So that's why one should not underestimate what you kind of said as obvious, because we love molecular biology. All these compartments have to communicate. So the right proteins have special signals. They have to be sent to precisely the right location. Precise location means it might mean inside an organelle. It might mean on the membrane. It might mean outside of the cell. It might mean on this side of the membrane. It might mean in the middle with parts on both sides. Everything has got to be precisely choreographed.
And in such a small space.
Right.
Well, that to me, from what you're describing to me, it sounds like there need to be instructions somewhere, some sort of I don't want to call it a master plan, but yeah, some sort of master plan of like, hey, how does this cell do this? And how does this cell work in concert with the trillions of other cells in a living body? Where does that come from? It sounds like it needs a ton of information, not just information, like random sporadic, the Wikipedia of the body, but it needs to be targeted. It needs to have commands of telling them what to do. So I would like to take a minute and talk about like, what is information in this regard? Where does that information come from? How is it targeted? Go.
But you said 1 minute. How could I possibly?
Shorten it, yeah.
Think of information exactly in the way that we use the word commonly and the way computer scientists use it. You've got variables that have values, and that's used to process logic. If this variable, this value, and this, then this that kind of logic. Mm-hmm. And so information is a way of storing an intended outcome for future use. So this is passed on from one cell to the other. And you're right, tons is probably the right word. This kind of information is stored in many media, in many places. It's stored on special sequences, on proteins, it's stored in sequences of nucleotides and RNA, on sequences on DNA, also on sugars, also membranes. There are special patterns. And these patterns are informative. These patterns are combinations, like I said, of nucleotides or combinations of amino acid residues. And these patterns are recognized by other molecules that dock there. Mm-hmm. And the combination together, when it docks, is informative. It means
kind of like a lock and key.
It's a lock and key.
Yeah.
That's correct. And in that sense, yes, there's programming, there's logic. If this, then began the following process. For example, if this, then this particular gene is now to be expressed. But if this now happens, now stop expressing it. It's the logic there.
Okay. What's your take on that, Dr. G?
Well, he explained it excellently. I mean, there's there was this view that the genome or DNA was the source of all of the information. It had the code of life,
Like the blueprint.
like a
Right.
blueprint. And we can't minimize the amount of information that is contained on DNA, but as Dr. Truman said, there is information coded and stored in so many interesting ways. It's fascinating. It's all over the cell. It's, as he mentions, it's spatial information. Like the way the things are arranged on our set is information. And so if we move the books around, that'd be different information. It's coded in phenomenal ways, which are pointing to a mind behind it, which is on orders and orders and orders of magnitude exceeding ours in every way, not only to come up with that information, but to find the ways to store all of this information and to make many of these cells operate in a way that is very autonomous. They're autonomous functioning things, and then there's communication systems through another wildly imaginative way of communicating from cells. They can use chemicals, they can use electrical signals, they can use touch, they can use mechanical stimulation. They can communicate in many, many different ways. So you have these autonomous cells communicating with each other and functioning together as a whole. And it's whoever dreamed this up, and I don't mean to say that the Lord is dreaming, but I mean in the human sense, whoever conceived of this is worthy of our adoration and worship.
And is certainly quite brilliant.
Well, that's
Yes.
what blows my mind, because when people look at anything else that has the qualities that you guys are talking about, the very distinct engineering qualities, if someone clicks on their iPad or something and things pop up, they don't think it just randomly happened or kind of formed itself to happen. They realize there's someone behind that doing the coding and all of the different processes that make that article pop up on their iPad screen. If somebody looks at a car, they don't think that those parts learned over a long period of time to function just right together. And people don't do that in any other area other than what we see in creation.
Right, exactly.
The interesting thing is, what you said is correct. The cell is actually vastly more complicated than any analogy you can come up with. Like you talk about the computer. Okay, you've got interfaces. You have like an input that allows you to work with a mouse, with your keyboard, maybe the internet. You have some interfaces. You look at the cell, and a typical cell in our bodies has about 1,000 kinds of sensors, on the outside, each linked to a unique program that allows it to respond to temperature, to hormones. And each of these 1,000 kinds of sensors are present in a vast number of copies distributed. So it's robust. That means that, like you said, in 3 dimensions, it can cover the whole outer surface of the cell and recognize anything like a communication, like a hormone from another cell or temperature in 3 dimensions. So that is a remarkable thing about not recognizing design. If you can recognize it in a computer with a dozen or so hardware components, then why don't you recognize in a cell that's got hundreds or thousands of hardware components? It's vastly more complicated.
That to me speaks kind of like a heart issue. There is no desire in, if someone is denying design, they don't want to admit that there is a designer for another reason other than just, they're very clearly turning a blind eye.
Right.
But that leads me to my next question, which is, so let's say someone does say, you know what, there's no designer because I have decided in my heart that there is no designer. So I'm seeing these things that clearly look designed. What do I do with this? So what is someone who doesn't believe in a designer, who doesn't believe that these were created by an intelligence vastly superior to our own, but instead say, oh, this just kind of happened? What do they make of this information, of this vast complexity, of these cities upon cities upon cities of cells? What do they do with that?
How do they explain it away?
Right, which they have to. They have to try.
Well, they come up with an alternative explanation, and Lauren mentioned it, nature. As the Bible even says, when they don't credit God as the creator, they end up worshiping and serving the created thing, which is nature itself.
Straight out of Romans 1.
More than the creator, exactly. They exchange the truth, actually, literally, the true for the false, the true God for the false God, and nature becomes the false God. And it's either God creates nature or nature creates itself, and they move over to the nature creates itself, and they come up with mechanisms to explain away obvious things. They're not going to explain away the sensors on the outside of the cell or the information. That's hard and fast. So you have to explain away how it got there. And there are two things that are really obvious when we look at cells or anything living. There's purpose. Things operate for a purpose. Everything, the sensors, it's all tied together with a purpose. So you have this purpose shouting at you. And how do I explain away purpose? And it seems to indicate agency. As we talked about, the only source for this is an agent. And so they explain away purpose by pointing to their mechanism, which is mutation selection. And mutation, this whole idea that changes in DNA, and that's pretty much what they focus on, happen purposelessly, without a purpose, blindly, randomly, and that the changes are broken and there's loss of function. So they interpret everything this way so that it's the exact opposite of what a real rational engineer would do. So they push back against purpose by introducing purposeless, mindless, random, broken systems. But then that leaves you a jumbled mess. So they bring in a substitute agent to sort it all out and to make sense of it, which is their natural selector. Their selector which can sort through the mess, pick what's good, leave what's bad, pick the few things that are good, leave the massive amount that's bad, and make sense of it all. And when they project onto nature this ability to select, they're projecting onto it intelligence and volition. So they and then they will say this blind, chaotic process was able to cobble together, tinker together over a really long period of time, all of this incredible complexity that you see. So they don't deny it, they come up with a replacement mechanism.
But that doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't match the reality.
You're explaining that, and I'm like, it just, I mean, and I've heard it explained before, but it's just like, there's nothing there.
Right.
There's nothing there.
It doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. But as an honest attempt to look at the other perspective, have they ever been able to replicate what they're talking about?
Let me make two comments about that. The first is, let's go back to your statement about as an engineer, you looked at systems. Very few scientists have actually looked at what's going on in a molecular cell and molecular biology as a system. They're very, very focused on the very small part. They got a PhD in biochemistry, they looked at one protein. So to be fair, very, very, very few people could sit here and give you an intelligent analysis of what's going on in a cell because they are too narrowly focused. So to be totally fair, very few people have been really exposed to that level of detail and sophistication, to be fair.
Okay.
The other is a very remarkable way of thinking. That is, whenever you read the scientific literature, they'll start off explaining some complex phenomena like a mechanism that they didn't know before. And they are forced by the culture to throw in a few statements down there like, and this occurred during the course of evolution, or this is refined by selection. It's a statement it's totally vacuous because it's saying absolutely nothing about that process they're talking about. You know, the eye of the octopus is convergence. What's happening is when you grow up as a scientist in biology, you read all this literature, you have this feeling, an intuition that evolution, without even thinking natural selection, whatever, evolution can do anything. It's magic. Scientists, they go and they look at nature because evolution was able to come up with these incredible designs and we can learn from it. Evolution can do things that no human could do, so we should learn from it. So my experience has been most atheists don't want to know about God because it's not convenient. And they don't really have a mechanism, and they don't care because they don't think this is important. It's been resolved that evolution has been proven by other smarter people somewhere to have done all of this. And evolution can do anything that God can do.
That's the
it's
thing.
an intuition.
That's the thing is you mentioned this, and I think Dr. Tompkins has mentioned this before in like how small of a purview that each specific scientist has. They're looking at such a small piece, and they all assume someone else has figured it out.
Right.
They don't have to figure it out. Someone else has already put all the pieces together.
When I was in graduate school, I started off in chemistry, and everybody was telling me evolution's a fact. And I was kind of wondering, how do you know this? So I would talk to the chemistry professors, and they would say, well, we don't know, of course. We're chemists. What do you think? You've got to talk to, and then they'd say, talk to the paleontologists. I'd talk to them and say, well, we're paleontologists. What do you want from us? You got to talk to the biologists. And they would send me somebody else, you know? And this went on for a couple of years, and eventually ended up back in the chemists again, because I was told that the prebiotic chemists had demonstrated all that it worked. And I kept saying, well, folks, where's the evidence? Everybody knows this is true. Everybody believes it. If you don't believe it, you're in trouble, because you're like, you really shouldn't be here in graduate school because there's something wrong with you. You know, you're not a real scientist. But nobody knew what the evidence was. Nobody, till today, I've never been able to find who are the people saying, listen, here is a good, solid reason for what I believe. Nobody can do this.
Well, it's all emotion, because it's very interesting. You mentioned a great word, magic. It's very interesting because we'll see comments on social media. We'll get input from people who disagree with where we're coming from as ICR. And they'll basically say, oh, you're big magic man upstairs. You're just giving him the credit for everything.
They call him the Magic Sky Fairy.
Yes, they do.
Magic Sky
They
Fairy.
have all kinds of 10 points for creativity. They have a lot of creative names for God. And yet, when it comes down to it, we'll get all of these emotional comments about these crazy people and these clowns and all kinds of things, some of which I won't mention.
Right.
And yet, they don't interact with the evidence that we're putting forward. And
That's the
they're
truth.
relying on something magical for their own explanation of how things came about. So that's just really interesting to interact with. And I hope, if some of those people are listening to this podcast today, that they will take an honest look at some of the evidence that we're putting forward before they make an emotional judgment about it and realize the evidence is there. You just have to look to see it. It's right there in front of scientists and lay people alike.
Let me statement that, because the idea of magic is just right. What is very, very remarkable in this attributing everything to evolution is that people are able to attribute totally contrary effects to the same magic. They can explain an increase in complexity, larger genomes, larger multicellular systems, and also a decrease, parasite. I have seen many papers where I saw one series of papers where people misunderstood the mathematics and ended up saying the exact opposite of another group, used exact same data. And one was saying, this is why it is clear that there was an increase in information from a Shannon theoretical point of view, and they gave a storyline. And the other people used the exact same data but had not done the math wrong, said, and here's how we can explain how information went down, and gave their storyline. So it's one of those crazy things that this miracle wonder can explain things rolling uphill and things rolling downhill. It can do anything.
Dr. G, I have heard you say some very helpful things over the years about this whole magical process that people call science when it comes to the evolutionary approach. So I know you have thoughts on it. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on some of these things we've talked about last couple minutes?
Well, it is magic, and they pepper their scientific papers with a bunch of magical words that cover over a massive amount of missing information. You want to go from point A to point B, well, that arose. Or point A to point B, it emerged.
Selective pressure.
Or selective pressures, which is a non-quantifiable thing. It's a concept in someone's mind. Some selective pressure moved it along these ways, or as Dr. Truman said, they just say it evolved. Or over a period of time, something gave rise to another thing.
With no mechanism
involved. So you have arose, emerged, gave rise to, evolved. You have these magical words, which in their papers, they think they're saying something, but they're not telling you anything. They're these giant leaps from here to here.
They're cop-outs.
And they're cop-outs, and they're not telling you anything. And really, as Trey mentioned, the mechanism sounds silly. It makes no sense. And they even recognize that. Famous evolutionist Richard Lewontin in a quote, which everybody quotes about him not allowing a divine foot in the door, which is true. But before that, he says, we take the side of something which he says is counterintuitive and mystifying to the uninitiated. And you really have to be initiated into evolutionary thinking in order for this stuff to make sense, because it is totally counterintuitive that a blind, irrational, purposeless process is going to bring all of this into existence.
It's almost like you have to join the religion,
right?
Of evolution.
Of evolution to be able to understand it. And it was something stuck out to me that you mentioned in your previous, what you were saying. You used the word storyline a couple of times. And I was like, that's really all it is. I mean, as we've learned more and more and how much more complex things are, cells in particular, but just everything is so complex when it comes to biology, chemistry, astronomy. And an evolutionist, by necessity, must continue to come up with more and more storylines, more and more fictional narrative, so that these new things that they learn can somehow be fit into this weird, cobbled together worldview that was false to begin with.
Right.
So.
That's a really important point, this idea of a storyline. I've heard so many examples of somebody doing some research that didn't lead the way they wanted to. In one case, they ended up with the wrong amino acids. They're saying this came out of a meteorite, and they gave the D amino acids. So they give a storyline saying, but there are some bacteria that do happen to have some proteins with the D type. Then they did some experiment 3 years later, the same group, and they found a catalyst, and under very, very, very special conditions, they redid the chemistry, and now they ended up with the kind of amino acid they wanted. So now they got another storyline. So they're like a politician. They can always give you a narrative. We heard a debate a week ago we were talking about where a fellow said there are so many lines of evidence being explored, promising evidence of what could have been an origin of life. All these different possible ideas making progress. That's his storyline. My storyline was the people started off looking at the things that possibly may make sense, the more obvious things, and nothing's working. They're running out of ideas. That's my storyline. I'm not saying you're making progress. I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying pretty soon there's not much left to look into. Nothing works. That's my storyline. So that's a danger of somebody collecting the data and then they deciding what how they should interpret it. It's just a story.
Well, and it's interesting because as believers, we never have to change our narrative because it's not fictional. It's true. And the person who was there in the beginning wrote it all out for us, and we don't have to change that narrative. We might learn different ways that he has instilled into his engineered into his universe as far as, this is how that process works, and this is how this process works. We're learning new things. But we never have to change our narrative. It's always the Lord Jesus Christ created everything we see, and we get to learn more and more about the things that he has created. But we don't have to worry about new evidence popping up that challenges our narrative because all the evidence that arises confirms what the Bible says.
I was about to say, there's more and more evidence that points the other direction. It's interesting to me. I think about, Usher did his timeline of history, right? And Usher the historian, not the rapper. And
I was gonna say, you might want to clarify that.
He did his timeline of history, and give or take 100 years or a decade here or there, we've never had to push it back. New information has come to light, and we learned that years were different back then, or something like that. It's actually 8,000. Now it's 12,000. Now it's 15,000. But when it comes to the Big Bang Theory and evolution, it's continually being pushed back. Until now, it's not even real time. It's monopoly time. They're just adding extra years because, of course it won't work now. Let's just add a little bit more time. And eventually they're going to hit eternity and it's still not going to work. So
the idea of time is a really good example because we're talking about cells. And I mentioned the idea of mutual interdependency, okay? To have DNA, to manufacture DNA, and to replicate DNA, you've got to have a whole bunch of special proteins. But the proteins themselves are coded for from the DNA. The DNA generates RNA, but the RNA can't be manufactured itself without proteins. None of that works without the tRNAs and the ribosomes. Everything's interconnected. Now, time. Time is a big enemy of a naturalist because let's just say you want to start somewhere. You want to start with anywhere you want to start. A bunch of proteins, a bunch of DNA. And it's kind of floating around for a few 10 millions of years. Is that going to help you?
No.
You think racemize, you hydrolyze. So the shorter the time period that everything can fall into place in one big swoop, the better your chances are that this is going to work. Let me give you an example. I'm going to ask you a question. If everything is so strongly interdependent and there's no starting order to assemble the parts, here's my question. Then how can we have a daughter cell from the original cell? How in the world can that work if you have no way to start building the separate components in order? Then how could that work?
If you only have one brick, you can't build the house. You have to have
Right.
all of them at once.
Right.
Well,
So
they have to all be there at the same time.
Yeah.
what has to be there at the same time?
All of it.
Exactly. That's the key. You see, before a cell replicates, it starts creating extra copies of all the things it needs. More ribosomes, more proteins. It starts to create a second copy of the DNA. But everything is a constant state of still living. It's still processing. So here is your cell. It starts to bud. It splits into parts. This extra membrane is built. It's manufactured. The new one is a little bit smarter, but it's functional. It has everything it needs in one swell swoop immediately to still live, to still work. And once it's still in place, then it can start manufacturing the more protein it needs, more RNA, because everything's in place. So time is the enemy of the naturalist. You can't start step by step.
It's almost like it was all there from the beginning when someone spoke it into existence.
May
But
very well be.
All right. Well, that is honestly, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I think that really for our audience, the big picture is when it comes to cells, when it comes to biological systems, the more we learn about them, we see that when we build things, we're following principles that were already put into place by someone much smarter than us. And it couldn't have all happened by chance. Like, there's no way that a cell, just a cell, a single cell, could have arisen by chance, much less everything else. You know, it's like almost mind-blowingly foolish to think that it could have. And so I just want to ask you, do y'all have any closing thoughts, any final statements, anything that you really just want to hit home with our viewers and listeners?
The more you learn about science, the more fun you're going to have. And you're asking the right questions as a creationist. I'm talking about molecular biology, but I've got a PhD in organic chemistry. I learned all this on my own, but just asking the right questions. And I just read the books. It all made sense. So by asking the right questions, you're going to discover things that you would never discover otherwise. You're going to discover that because everything is programmed, there are many codes and programs yet to be discovered. Even though I have recognized a lot of principles from hardware and software that we use in our own technologies, I've discovered a lot of principles in cells, coding principles that hasn't occurred to us. They're new ideas that maybe we could start implementing. Because you see, there's so much going on in a cell that is beyond what a computer has to do. It doesn't have to self-repair. It doesn't have to build all of its components. It doesn't have to code for all of its own hardware. It doesn't have to gracefully commit suicide when it's no longer needed. These are all the things a computer doesn't need, and therefore the coding logic is also vastly more complex. We can learn a lot. And maybe I'll have a chance afternoon or some other time to talk to some computer people about the techniques that I've discovered in cells that hasn't occurred to us to ever use in our own programming. So we can learn a lot as scientists by being a believer who believes that there was a designer far smarter than us, and we can learn from those principles.
Absolutely. Dr. G?
Well, I can't really add a lot more to what Dr. Truman said. He sums it up very, very well. But as you mentioned at the very beginning, world views matter. Mm-hmm. The way you look at the world matters, and theory matters. How are you going to interpret what you are seeing? Mm-hmm. Evolutionists have their theory, and that is how they explain the design of living things, and that's how they interpret biological observations. ICR, I believe, is on the right track. We're moving towards an engineering-based approach to biology. Mm-hmm. We're not just saying organisms were designed, we're treating them and researching them as if they truly are designed. Mm-hmm. And engineering makes the best sense of everything that Dr. Truman was just talking about, how all the parts have to be at the right place, at the right time, and the right amounts according to a schedule. Mm-hmm. Engineers put this together, and we do this all the time. Mm-hmm. We put together parts where there's causal circularity. If you need A to make B and B to make A, we put them into place at the right time, and we find that in cells all together. So I would encourage whoever is listening to our podcast, stick with us, read our magazines, go to icr.org, keep up with what we're doing in terms of explaining living things, in terms of an engineering-based approach that is focused on the organisms, and I think you'll have a much, much better framework.
Absolutely. Lauren?
No, I think we've covered it. Okay. This has been really, really helpful.
Just wanted to give you the chance. Awesome. Well, thank y'all so much for being here and for chatting with us. It's been a fascinating conversation. Mm-hmm. It's not something that I'm super well versed in. I love computers. I'm not a molecular biologist, so it's very unique perspective to see how it all fits together. So thank y'all so much for being here. And thank you to all of our listeners and viewers. We appreciate you stopping by and watching this podcast. Make sure to like, subscribe, share it with your friends. If you have an IT nerd friend, send them this podcast. If you have a molecular biologist nerd friend, send them this podcast. And we just really want to get this truth out to everyone that we can. And so we'll see you next time on Creation.Live. We want to say a huge thank you to our members and patrons. If you'd like to see your name here and unlock perks like early access to our podcasts, members-only polls and live streams, behind-the-scenes footage, or exclusive video content, links are in the description below.